Welcome to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today, I'd like to talk about AI data centers and the impact it has on the power grid. And I'd like to welcome back to the show Jason Haas. Jason, welcome back.
Hey, Alex, thank you so much for having me back. It's great to be here. Looking forward to this conversation.
Always a pleasure chatting with you, and I knew you were the right person to talk to about this. Now, back in mid-January, January 18th, CNN had a article about AI data centers and the impact it's having on the power grid, how and the different needs that these data centers require. And I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, it's not something everyone takes into consideration as we hop into our favorite AI platform and develop some dank meme or have it maybe analyze a plan or something, that there's these costs for it. Just it's at somewhere in the world, a data center is spooling up to create that wonderful image that you just asked ChatGPT to create. Just like you see things going on in Facebook right now where everyone's, ChatGPT, here's a photo of me, make a photo of me with what you know. Those have real costs. Those are spooling up servers and GPUs and all the assets that a data center needs to run AI. And AI, if you don't know, is extremely resource hungry. So it consumes a ton of power. It runs on GPUs. It requires, if it uses a lot of power, then we need those other data center resources. So we need cooling. We need more space. We need so much. There's a lot that goes in to data center management. And with AI and AI-based data centers, that power consumption for the communities and surrounding communities is immense.
How are we getting this increased uh, power levels, that we're out there? Because it seems as though we are creating data centers, and the need for power is increasing faster than our ability to create it. Hence,
Right.
as you mentioned, the costs are going up.
Right. And the costs are going up. And you're right, that power has to come from somewhere. So we're talking large amounts of money at play here to the point where, like nuclear power stations that had been shut down before, like Three Mile Island, not the impacted reactor, by the way, the remaining infrastructure was brought back online because a large player, if I remember correctly, Microsoft paid billions of dollars for that data center, or not for that data center, for that power plant to generate power for its data center. Or we see it in local communities where the communities are being asked to bear the burden of the additional costs of the data centers, where the idea of the data centers are, oh, we're going to bring these blue collar, white collar, high paying jobs to your communities while they're taking all of the resources at the same time. So communities end up having to bear the burden of these costs from data centers. If you read an article, Port Washington, Wisconsin, there was a proposed data center to go into that area. There was broad community pushback around that due to not only the noise, but also the resources consumption of that particular data center. And if you look at Port Washington, Wisconsin on the map, there's a rather large body of water next to it called Lake Michigan. Data centers need resources. Not only do they consume power, but what's one of those outputs of power? Heat. So we have to dissipate heat too. And heat can be dissipated using water cooling systems, crack cooling, which is glycol based, closed loop type systems. So the fact is that this organization wants to put a data center next to one of the large Great Lakes as well as tap the power grid. Well, it's checking two boxes for them. One, power and cooling. But again, there's that dilemma of who is then bearing the burden of that? Can our grid, which in certain areas may be well taxed, can it handle those additional demands? So many questions.
You mentioned a few points there. The first one I want to ask you about is you said data centers and noise. What kind of noise is that? I
Well,
drive by, factories and things like that all the time, and there's not a lot of noise, at least not that I can tell, but then I'm in a car. So what
right.
kind of noise are we talking about here?
Well, with data centers, especially large scale data centers, their cooling plants will be external of the building. So you have the whir of those different chillers and coolers outside. If they're on generator power, which the demands on for the generators, you'll have those large diesel farms, generator farms running, which there's additional noise pollution. But data centers by themselves can be noisy. You have, hundreds, if not thousands of computers within tight quarters inside of a building, each that have power and cooling, which means there's fans, there's all sorts of noise. So you get this whir of it. Think of it like that tower sitting next to your, desk or something like that, and you're doing an intensive task and you hear the laptop spool up for cooling down or your tower cooling down. Think of that times a thousand. And data centers are usually built with, noise abatement and things like that in the forefront of its design. But nonetheless, data centers are loud. It's not like you go to your outside of one and you hear it all the time, but in communities where some of these are being placed, which are remote areas, it's not putting them in like downtown Chicago or Toronto or things like that, but by all means, there's data centers in those areas. But these large data centers are being put more in rural areas, which they're not used to that type of, so to speak, white noise. And from the reports that I've heard and read, that these data centers have been a burden on those communities from a noise pollution standpoint, as well as the consumption of resources as well.
I was just going to say that there's the burden of them drawing all this water as well to keep things cool. Is there any negative output coming from these data centers, like contaminated water? Is the higher risk of that occurring now if these data centers want water or if they're getting rid of something in these communities? Because you mentioned, the city there where a proposed data center wants to be beside a lake. Um, Chances are pretty good there could be some contamination there.
Right. And by contamination, it wouldn't be so much like chemicals in the water per se, but it would be taking in cold water. Think of this Port Washington, Wisconsin example where they might be drawing in, this time of year, Lake Michigan water, which might be a little bit chilly considering what the Midwest is right now. Um, and then it's doing heat transference. So it's taking the heat out of the data center, putting it into the water, and then returning the water back to, the Great Lake. Well, we're pumping out warm water. So what's that going to do to the ecosystem that may not be used to those type of temperatures? Are we going to see maybe, an algae bloom? Probably, warm water in those type of areas that aren't used to it. I can definitely see algae blooms. It could be some fish kills and some other, aquatic life disruption that may not be used to those type of water. So, or that temperature of water. So we may see some fish kills and some other issues put into there, which then what about migratory birds that may be feeding on those fish? And what if it's a blue-green algae bloom, which can be toxic to animals? Are we going to see additional die-off as those birds eat those fish and take those elsewhere? Anyways, it's that whole ripple effect. This is really, environmentalism 101. If we take in that water, that's cold. We superheat it by transferring heat out of the data center, and then we return it back to its destination. There is going to be some sort of negative effect. So we have to keep that in mind as a potential issue is we really have some environmental concerns, maybe not the poisoning of the water per se with chemicals, but a poisoning of the water by returning it back to the environment in an above normal temperature.
Which means these data centers, as you said, ripple effects can have an impact on other parts of the economy, livelihoods, because a lot of cities around the Great Lakes draw their water source from the Great Lakes. So if that becomes like algae blooms or something like that, that could destroy the fishing. It can ruin technology. Sorry, tourism, I meant to say, not technology. Tourism and drinking water hazards, which can then, if people are catching fish that have been contaminated, they can get sick as well. So it just keeps going and going and going. But there was a, let me see, there, I have it here somewhere, DCs are projected to consume about 6.7 to 12% of the US electricity in by 2028. So we're heading versus 4.4 in 2023. So it's increasing these data centers. So all these ripple effects are and downstream impacts are going to increase as well. And the more
Right.
and more we use AI and build these data centers, the greater the impacts are occurring. It's like we're helping ourselves on one hand with AI because it can be very helpful, but we're hurting ourselves on the other hand.
Right. And let's, talk about the power sources. Okay, so we've talked about energy. Is it all clean energy? Renewables? Are we talking wind power, solar power, hydropower? Yes. However, we're also talking about nuclear power. We're talking about coal power. So we have, natural gas type power. So we're burning all of these natural resources in the effort to support these data centers with these large consumptions. So not only are we reviving, retired nuclear power plants, I've got notes over here, Three Mile Island and Duane Arnold, Iowa. We're also extending the life of like coal and natural gas plants, things that maybe we were hoping to starting to decommission and replace them with cleaner based energy. There's also these direct tech energy partnerships too, where again, the amount of money in play here, it's stupid money, where all of a sudden people like Anthropic or OpenAI, okay, we can't get it from the grid. We'll just go build our own power plant and serve ourselves. We'll go stand up a nuclear power plant, a coal power plant, natural gas power plant, renewables. Holy moly. I mean, just the implications. All of a sudden, we're going to have all this other energy infrastructure that's not meant to support the grid or the communities that may be having some of that financial burden in supporting it. Most likely, there'll be tax incentives by different legislatures out there to spur growth of not only the data center in their area, but maybe the additional powers as well. And in the US, at least, when we start giving out those financial incentives, who pays for those? I do. The community does. And the community doesn't always have a voice in whether they actually wanted that to begin with. So, and the type of jobs it might be bringing in might not be the type of jobs that that region has. So we're going to have to import people too. There's just this whole ripple effect. But, looping it back to data centers, that power consumption isn't clean power. So then we have, global warming type issues, and we can get in going down those rabbit holes. We have all this infrastructure going in that's running 24/7, 365 that eats electricity, eats cooling abilities for lunch. How is this sustainable? And AI hasn't hit its peak. We see all these Oracle agreements out there standing up data centers left and right. Amazon's doing data centers, Claude, Anthropic, OpenAI, and partnerships and all that. All of these AI-based data centers all across the US. Our appetite for them is much larger than I think what we're capable of eating. There's going to be a point where I think we're going to tip. Anyways, uh, there's finite resources, but there's a lot of demand for data centers. So how do we balance it?
And the infrastructure to support it is aging.
Right?
We've seen that across Canada, across the US, across, well, everywhere around the globe. Infrastructure does not keep pace with our need for AI or data centers or anything that we seem to throw at it.
Right. And it is the way our grid, our infrastructure has been designed, eons ago and updated throughout out the decades. Is it designed for this type of draw on demand? My guess is no. So are we going to see things like Texas, which, that's not initially the example has nothing to do with data centers, but the collapse of the particular power grid due to demands on it, due to not normal cold weather, therefore causing, a huge draw and a collapse of that infrastructure.
Any final thoughts on AI, data centers, and the power grid?
Yeah, so it's a double-edged sword. Here, I love AI and I love what it can do for me in summarizing emails and transcripts and all these other, use cases. But at the end of the day, that efficiency has a trade-off. So when we're engaging with AI, as we use it in our businesses, we also need to think about that other side. How do we support its energy consumption? How can we spur the developers to create more leaner less resource hungry type processes so we don't need all of this type of power. We don't need all this type of cooling, and we don't need hundreds, if not thousands, of data centers throughout the US. It's a big question that industry, and the communities that support these really need to lean in and talk about. There's no great answer, but next time you create, that dancing, talking cat in Sora or something like that, think of some poor community that might be a burden to.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our show today. Jason, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alex.